and especially Anna for the very nice invitation. Like, I have never received a nicer invitation to attend a conference than that, Anna. So really, thank you very much. So my talk maybe is a little bit different because my specialty is basically Islamic philosophy and theology. Talking with some of the people during the break, I realized that maybe some of the concepts, some of the schools of thought people are not familiar with. So let me very briefly introduce that mainly my specialty and my focus was on an early theological school that developed in Islam as early as the 8th century. They are called Al-Mu'tazila. They are kind of a school that kind of fell out of favor by the 11th century and replaced by another school called Al-Ash'ariyya, established by Abu al-Hasan al-Ash'ari, and it is the Ash'ari school of theology that mainly prevailed in the Sunni Islam, while the Mu'tazili school of theology that was seen by some as being kind of more rational, more focused on reason. They are sometimes called the defenders of reason in Islam, had to migrate eastward toward Persia. So, but anyway, of course, contemporary scholars, they are including both schools of thought. They are building their ideas, their arguments on both schools of thought. The disagreement between the Ash'ariyya and the Mu'tazila is seen, at least by some scholars, as part of the past. So basically, that is what I am interested in. By the way, before I became a specialist in, I would like to see myself as a specialist in ethics in the Islamic tradition. I worked for 17 years as a medical physicist in a radiotherapy department in Jordan. So this is my second life career, or you can say my retirement job. Right. So, unlike my dear colleagues who have so many beautiful pictures to show, I have nothing to show. In philosophy, we mainly read and write. So I'm going to read a very short presentation for you. Well, in recent decades, philosophers have intensely debated the meaning of personhood and what it means to be human. Some have sought to blur the lines between human beings and non-human animals, while others challenge the distinction between humans and machines. Yes, humans and machines. The rise of what is called enhanced humans and AI robots in technologically advanced societies risks devaluing normal humans, potentially justifying new forms of racism. Thus, many scholars attempt to safeguard human dignity by emphasizing unique human qualities like consciousness, self-awareness, emotions, or the more religious concept of human soul. An understanding of what it means to be human, rooted in the Islamic intellectual tradition of the speculative theology or philosophical theology, al-kalam, and falsafa, which is mainly the philosophy of the so-called Muslim philosophers that was in the Greek tradition, that followed the Greek tradition. Indeed, kalam and falsafa could contribute, I think, to that ongoing debate of what is a person and what is a human being. When we talk about Islamic thought, we have to start from the Holy Quran. So the Quran uses the term insan, human, nafs, soul, and ruh, spirit, and al-mir, person, referring to different ontological dimensions of the human beings. Pre-Islamic Arabic poetry. In pre-Islamic Arabic poetry, the words nafs was used to refer to self or person, while ruh meant breath and wind. This understanding seems to have continued in the Quran, which in most cases uses nafs to refer to the human self or person, and ruh to the breath of life, since God blew or nafakha of his ruh to Adam, giving life to Adam's body. No doubt that ideological and theological motives played a considerable part in drafting and answering questions about the human self in Islamic speculative theology or kalam. Muslims' understanding of the human being had to take into consideration the distinguished role that humans are expected to take in this world as custodians of nature, which is emphasized in the Holy Quran. Also, one of the major religio-political issues raised by early mutakallimin, the theologians of Kalam of the 8th century, was the issue of free will and predestination. Theories of actions that stressed man's causal power were developed by the Mu'tazila, the early school of Kalam, and that definitely sparked the debate about the true essence of the human being, which is locus of this power or capacity to act. They debated whether this locus of the capacity of act or a human being, whether it's corporeal or incorporeal, is it located in the heart, in the brain, or in the whole of human body? Is it divisible to different powers or faculties, or is it not? How should we understand the self in relation to our natural philosophy and theology? What was at stake was who or what is the nature of the true agent. Some thought that it is an entity separate from the human body. Others believed that it is immanent in the human body, and some emphasized that it is basically the human body itself that has various qualities that distinguish it from the bodies of other beings. Of course, the mutakallimun had to fit their views into the framework of their natural philosophy. Human ontology in the Kalam tradition is based on a theory called the theory of atomism, and yet it's not always evident how theory of atomism, held by most of the mutakallimin, can be applied to describe the nature of the human being. Atoms, or substances, in Arabic jawahir, are essentially basic concepts into which all created things can be classified, and accidents, al-a'rad, are the various properties or qualities that inhere in these atoms or in bodies. Variations of this theory allowed for different understanding of human beings. Most of the early mutakallimin emphasized the corporeal nature of the human self. They rejected body-soul dualism and the view that the soul is the essence of a human being that can exist on its own. Their position can be compared to the Falasifa who followed in the Greek tradition, including the earliest among them, Yaqub bin Ishaq al-Kindi, who died at the beginning, by the end of the 9th century. The focus of the Falasifa was centered on the soul, nafs, understood in line with Neoplatonic philosophy as a spiritual, incorporeal entity higher and nobler than the body. It's only, in fact, in the late 5th, 11th century, and most probably under the influence of the famous philosopher Ibn Sina or Avicenna and other philosophers, that the Ash'arite mutakallimun, the more orthodox Muslim theologians that prevail today in the Sunni Islam, including Abu Hamid al-Ghazali, turned away from this theory of man towards a more philosophically influenced body-soul dualism. Most probably, many of us are familiar with the concept of the soul. It is basically the concept accepted in most or in all of the religious traditions. And the human being is seen like, or the essence of the human being is seen as the soul. So I'm not going to focus on the philosophical understanding of the human essence or on the later theological developments, but I will talk about the early Mu'tazila and early Ash'ari and their understanding of the human self. In fact, prominent members of both Mu'tazili and Ash'ari schools of Kalam, who otherwise disagreed on almost everything, such as Al-Qadi Abdul Jabbar al-Mu'tazili and al-Baqillani, both died at the beginning of the 11th century, emphasized the corporeal nature of the human being. Abu al-Hasan al-Ash'ari, the founder of the Ash'arite school of theology, after whom the school was named, followed Abu Hudayl al-Allaf, the early Mu'tazilite, in holding that the definition of man is this visible body that is composed in this manner of composition and structured in this type of specific structure. So he emphasized the corporeal nature of man. In Arabic, he said, هذا الجسد الظاهر المركب بهذا التركيب المبني بهذا الدرب من البنية المخصوصة. Abdul Jabbar, the Mu'tazilite, dedicated a section from his 20-volume book, Al-Mughni, to discuss this agreement on the nature of human being. ذكر الخلاف في الإنسان. He argued against the belief that the soul is what defines a human being and that life and power belong to it. He compared the view that life and power belong to something other than the whole or the composite body, which he called al-jumla, to the view that blackness, for example, is an entity that exists on its own. And just as the black indicates nothing but the locus of blackness, al-mahal, the human soul and nafs indicates nothing but the whole of the human structure, al-jumla, or the human body with all its sophisticated structures. Power or capacity to act cannot exist without connection to a body, just as blackness or any other color cannot exist on its own without a body. He rejects the idea of a soul that is distinct from the body. It is the whole and composite body, jumla, that is alive and able and not something in it or above it. Ruh, the spirit, is a prerequisite for life, just as blood and bodily structure are prerequisites of life, or pre-requirements of life. The spirit, al-ruh in Arabic, which is often identified with the soul and nafs, is viewed as breath or gasp of air, nafas, and is not considered to be a living entity and is not described as living. Of course, this view was very controversial and was not accepted by most of the philosophers. So, indeed, it is interesting to see how Abu Hamid al-Ghazali, a contemporary of Qadi Abdul Jabbar, narrates a story of a theologian discussing, it's an anecdote actually between a theologian and most probably a philosopher. He said, Abu Hamid, Tawhidi, I'm talking about Abu Hayyan al-Tawhidi, who narrated this anecdote. He said that a certain theologian, mutakallim, was asked about the meaning of the words nafs and ruh, to which that theologian replied, nafas and rih, wind, respectively. Based on what you said, the theologian's adversary commented, every time a person breathes, tanaffasa, his soul, nafs, exits the body. And every time he breaks wind, I'm not going to say the word in Arabic. His spirit, ruh, exits the body. Well, regardless of that, what actually mattered for Abdul Jabbar and the Mu'tazila, what actually really mattered for Abdul Jabbar is not the ontological nature of man, but what it means to be a human person or moral agent. This can be compared to the view of the contemporary New Zealand philosopher Tom Harey, who always preferred expressions like what it is to be a human being over the more common ones, such as human nature. Emphasizing the human's moral self, Abdul Jabbar prefers to use the term mukallaf over the term insan, human being. He dedicates a few chapters to the discussion of the conditions that must be fulfilled by a moral agent, mukallaf. These conditions are the qualities of a human being that make him or her a true responsible person or a moral self. They include maturity, moral knowledge, the ability to comprehend ethical judgment, and the ability to choose and perform the chosen course of action. The moral agent, al-mukallaf, is able, qadir, knowing, alim, perceiving, mudrik, living, high, willing, murid, regardless of his or her ontological structure. Some might object, for translating mukallaf to moral agent. However, I guess one is justified to translate al-mukallaf, to translate it, the mukallaf, which literally means the obliged one, to moral agents, since the earliest Muslim theologians, the Mu'tazila, including Abdul Jabbar, distinguished between the religious obligation, al-taklif al-shar'i, and rational obligations, al-taklif al-aqli, while the former requires believing in God and the Sharia, the latter applies to all human beings, including non-believers. The last part of my short presentation actually asks a question which I recently became interested in. How is that still relevant today? How can we relate that to contemporary concerns? And I thought that this is taking us to the discussion that is related to post-modernist and post-humanist understanding and critiquing of the meaning of human self. I'm sure that some of you are familiar with the name of the very famous philosopher Michel Foucault. In his book, The Order of Things, Michel Foucault famously announced the death of man. He claimed that the human being is an invention that is now erased, like a face drawn in sand at the edge of the sea. This form of anti-humanism constitutes a springboard for the subsequent post-human philosophies and movements that are still unfolding. Post-humanists argue that we must reject the values attached to the idea of the human, along with all the other binaries, such as human-animal, man-woman, white-black, reason-passion, and born-made. Post-humanist approach also tends to break away from the notion of personhood in their argument against human exceptionalism. Meanwhile, emerging technologies destabilize concepts like person that were once taken for granted in different world cultures. Most contemporary scholars actually favor postmodernist and posthumanist perspectives. Understandably, the justified appeal of some postmodern movements actually lies in their challenge to power hierarchies, colonialism, and white supremacy. However, I was glad to come across an article, a very recent article, 2024, by Sven Brinkmann, a Danish professor of psychology, who has recently argued that we have good reason to retain a notion of personhood despite post-human claims. Indeed, undermining and rejecting the concept of a person is, in my view, tantamount to throwing the baby with the bathwater. The person, al-mukallaf, or in a more modern secular language, al-shakhs, is a whole who has thoughts, emotions, identity, and all the other psychological properties. Moreover, a person is a vulnerable being, and this is why she has rights that machines, including the most sophisticated AI robots, don't. A person is not a substance with properties as suggested by atomism, which is, in fact, an outdated theory of nature. And most probably, he's not only a soul. A person is a being to which an ensemble of dispositions can be ascribed. Some of these dispositions are unique to human persons, such as the abilities related to moral responsibility. However, this does not represent a problematic human exceptionalism, any more than the ability of bats to use echolocation represent bat exceptionalism. And we do not need to question human exceptionalism to recognize, for example, what is at stake in the campaigns of activists protesting against the cruel treatment of animals. Moral agency and personhood belong to humans, not to animals, not to the recent human-like robots or humanoids. Well, the main point of my presentation is that achieving a complete understanding of human nature, whether spiritual, physical, or both, might always remain elusive. However, this does not prevent us from exploring questions about ourselves beyond the limits of any general theory of human nature. We can build on the views of the mutakallimin, who lived during a time of vibrant discussion about what it means to be human, and this presentation hopefully tried to demonstrate. And thank you.
Thank you so much. It was a lot, and we have some time for questions. Okay, Maurice was first.
Hi. You're mentioning some of my friends, long-lost friends in this talk. My long-lost friends, yes. Abu Hayyan Tawhidi is a great friend. I mean, is an amazing author, one of my favorites. Okay. I wanted to ask you a little bit, or maybe even think about some of the broader themes that perhaps we'll touch upon in this conference about changing public spaces. Just bear with me for a second. Changing public spaces, the metaverse, things like that, right? Different ideas of sort of personhood, and there has been a move actually recently. There's a book by Megan O'Gablin called, I think, God, Machine, Animal, which revisits Christian theology. She had gone to Bible school in America, and she sort of was revisiting sort of the later changes in AI. What do they say about personhood from her sort of previous life as a deep believer in Christianity? Okay. And the reason I bring this up is because as I was listening to your talk about the Mu'tazila and the Falasifa, I was thinking about actually the problem of bodily resurrection being central. Because, of course, the philosophers deny bodily resurrection, And the Mu'tazila, I wrote my first book on Sahib ibn Abad, who was the great patron of the Mu'tazila, kind of the person who more or less, I think, was the most instrumental in bringing them together, to making them a movement. He would be damned, and literally I mean that, to deny bodily resurrection. In fact, as you well know, the Mu'tazila almost had this, I always think of like Star Trek. They had this idea that your atoms will reassemble in the afterlife. That is they really believed in atomism working like, and those kinds of ideas, that kind of fantasy about ourselves, I guess, is the springboard to thinking about how we might use or might interact with this past. I mean, you're doing it clearly. I wanted to think about it more broadly because I see it now very common in fantasies about, and maybe they will be one day realities about, bear with me, this is really a stretch, but the uploading of human minds to a metaverse, right? What does that mean? Are we selves then? What is central to the self? Is it the mind or is it the body? How does there's an amazing novel by Neil Stephenson which tackles this very topic. So people are imagining it, and I wonder, actually, Islamic theologians were already dealing with these problems, I think, in a way. Especially, and the crux of it, I guess my question to you would be, if there's a question in all of that, is when I was listening to it, I was wondering, my sense for the Mu'tazila, it's all well and good to say that their atomism is not a viable, it's an old theory for sure, right? But I think, part of me also thinks, what was the cart, what was leading the cart? I mean, what's the horse there? And I wonder, it's often portrayed that it's their, they sort of backed themselves into theological corners and had to come up with theories, but that's actually not entirely true. I've seen them as incredible system builders, and really, they are incredible speculative. And I would like to sort of maybe think about them as offering maybe who knows, maybe these pieces of ourselves that eventually will come to have an afterlife on our, are they ourselves? Are they ourselves, the things that we curate on the internet and put up there and leave now, they say, forever? I had a darn difficult time erasing my Facebook account. Are they ourselves? What is our afterlife, in a way, even from a purely secular point of view? What will be like? This kind of speculation is actually, to my mind, still quite relevant, actually, still quite, poignant, but it has to be seen obliquely. Yeah.
Thank you very much for very valuable comments. Yes, I agree with you. Actually, I included a few other thoughts
Yes.
when I talked about ideological and theological considerations that the Mu'tazila had to take into consideration where building their theories. Definitely bodily resurrection was one of them.
Yeah, sure.
And mainly, one of the reasons, I would say, if not the main reason, why they had problems with accepting Neoplatonic conception of the soul is because when you talk about the spirit, the soul, was very much associated with the idea of transmigration of the soul, which was accepted early by An-Nazzam, who was one of the Mu'tazila, which was accepted by Plato and also many Neoplatonists. So that is definitely there, one important reason for rejecting the idea of the soul that can live on its own, and that is higher of the body. And but the main idea that you talked about, how is it possible to imagine or to use the Mu'tazila and to build on what they have in order to think about resurrection or what is going to happen to human being. Those are very difficult questions and amazing questions, really. And I'm hoping in the coming year to focus more on the understanding of a human self, and what is called sometimes transhumanism. And I was fascinated to find around 10 to 12 articles written by Muslim scholars in 22, 23, 24, where they focus on transhumanism. Like, of course, like for those who are not familiar, like the transhumanism is basically that philosophical movement or that movement which talks about the enhancement of the human being, of the possibility of freeing us from the limitations of body, mind, space, and time. And this can be made by different technological advancement, like biotechnology, like genetic interventions, and robotics as well. So now, most of you maybe have seen like those Elon Musk robots that are becoming very famous, and some futurist philosophers and thinkers, they talk about the possibility in the very near future of having those humanoids or very human-like robots living among us, doing different functions. And there are some who are already asking for robots' rights, something similar to human rights, because those also have intelligence. Some say that they are developing consciousness, but of course that very much depends on our definition of what conscience means. And like the mind uploading, yes, maybe if that can ever be achieved, and if we can upload our mind on a machine that will like outlive us, something, it's not a flesh, which is definitely going to decompose, but if we can upload our mind to a machine, isn't that something like that has always been the dream of many philosophers, immortality? Isn't that something like uploading your soul to the machine and make it live? So yes, thank you for your valuable comments and fascinating ideas, yes.
Beautiful. I mean, I had the pleasure to talk to you before this interesting talk. It was a little bit like you need to focus 100%, otherwise you will not get the full point. I mean, for us Arabic speakers, we kind of like get a little bit, I get to study a little bit ilm al-kalam, and I know about Mu'tazila a little bit, and the opening of Muslims, in the beginning there was they were like united all around, Quran. There was no big differences. And then after, when they opened up a little bit on like, Greek, philosophy and all of that stuff, and then Ilm al-Kalam started, and then there was like big fitnas and big things like fitnat khalq al-Quran, the creation of, is Quran the word of God, or is it the creation of God? But I mean, my point was transhumanism, because you said, why are we even having this conversation? I think more than any time before, we need to have this conversation around transhumanism, because while the masses are getting entertained with, like, let's say, breads and circus, just give them what to eat, entertain them, and then let them not think, and then the masses are like brainwashed. Like those who are in power and the decision makers, like people like, for example, in the World Economic Forum, where Harari, the guy, he's a spokesperson. He's like, humans, long is gone the time where humans are these like sacred beings. They are hackable animals, and then basically just merging man with machine is what Klaus Schwab is pretending. And then entities like, I don't know, like Rockefeller Foundation or like John Hopkins, and all of these guys are like working towards achieving what you were talking about. Don't you think that we really should have like this conversation on a bigger scale? Get people around like, hey, this is the future where they want to lead us. Let's talk about it.
Of course, you are right. I fully agree with you. But you know what makes me a little bit hesitate? What makes me hesitate, although like most of the Muslim scholars who wrote on the topic, they were strongly against transhumanism, like using all kinds of arguments against it. But on the other side, you see that there are institutions in Qatar, in the Emirates, in Saudi Arabia, who are very much into AI technology and even robotics. So like, I thought first, like, we are against that, we don't want, okay? But wait a minute, weren't we against the printing press when it was first invented? And that's why we were like lagging behind for a long time. So maybe part of me was like, we should, like, yes, definitely we have to think about it. Definitely we have to put a limit between what it means to be a human being and a machine, but not to that extent of rejecting the technology altogether, because like at the end, there are certain kinds of technology that like 15 years ago, I did not imagine. But now, like everyone is having it, and it is not that expensive. You can find like quite cheap mobiles. It is not really dividing. Everyone has a mobile. So yes, definitely we need to engage in the topic. Definitely we need to have discussion. But we have to be like careful not to reject the technology altogether because, for example, we don't like the United States, or we don't like Elon Musk, or we don't like that kind of technology. We still need to like be technologically aware and know what is happening, but without being like, without thinking that we are not human beings anymore and that those machines are the same as ourselves or so. Thank you very much for the question.
Thank you.